What just happened between Washington and Ottawa sent a more consequential shock through North American energy strategy than any tariff fight we have seen in years, and almost nobody in the American press is explaining what it actually means. Mark Carney, working alongside his unity cabinet and a small circle of provincial premiers, just gave the White House the answer it did not want to hear on one specific file, Canadian crude, and it is directly connected to the broader CUSMA renegotiation that kicks off next year, and U.S. energy planners should be losing sleep over it. If this kind of structural analysis, the story underneath the story, is what you're here for, subscribe and hit the like button, drop a comment, and tell us where you're watching from. This is the coverage that connects what standard reporting leaves separate. Let's start with what actually happened. In the last few weeks, Donald Trump and senior members of his administration have made very public requests to Canada. Pump more oil, ship more oil, send more barrels south. The framing in Washington was simple. The United States needs more crude. Canada has the supply. Therefore, Canada should send. That is the surface story, and every major outlet ran with exactly that framing. Trump asks Canada for more oil. Ottawa under pressure to open the taps. Headlines like that, loud, obvious, easy. But here is the problem. The real story is not what the White House asked for. The real story is what Mark Carney said next. And what Carney did not say is even more important. Carney faced the press, answered questions about U.S. energy requests, and came out with a line that sounded calm, technical, and cooperative on the surface. He said Canadian oil would stay competitive. He said the industry was well positioned. He said nothing political. He said nothing aggressive. Then, in a different setting, without a press camera flashing, he said the quiet part out loud. Canada will double its non-U.S. exports over the next 10 years. Pause on that for a moment. In one breath, Canada told Washington, your oil is welcome. In the next breath, Canada told the rest of the world, we are about to send twice as much to everyone who is not you. That is not a contradiction. That is a strategy. And it is the kind of strategy that makes energy ministries in other capitals very uncomfortable. Because it means Canada is no longer treating the United States as its captive customer. Canada is treating the United States as one customer among many. And for the first time in a generation, Canada is preparing for the possibility that the U.S. relationship changes on terms Ottawa does not control. So let's break down the visible story properly. What exactly did Washington ask for? The U.S. side sent a clear message. North American energy security is a priority. We want to reduce dependence on distant suppliers. We want stable, friendly, integrated supply. We want Canadian crude. We want it now. We want it at scale. Some of this framing was polite, some of it was not. Some of it was wrapped in language about sovereignty, about North American resilience, about shared borders and shared interests. Underneath all of that language sat a simple ask: more barrels. Now, here is where the standard coverage stops, because once that ask was made, the natural follow-up should have been, what did Canada actually do? Not what did Canada say it would do. What did Canada actually do? Answer: Canada accepted the request in tone, but rejected the framing in practice. Let me explain what I mean. Canada sits on the world's third largest oil reserves. The vast majority of those reserves sit in Alberta, in the oil sands. Canada is already the single largest source of crude imports into the United States, by a wide margin. Canadian heavy crude flows south through an integrated pipeline network that took decades to build. It feeds U.S. refineries along the Gulf Coast and the Midwest. So when Washington says, send more, it is not asking Canada to do something new. It is asking Canada to do more of the same thing it has been doing for 40 years. The trap is in that word, more, because the moment Washington publicly identifies Canadian oil as a strategic asset it depends on, Canada holds a new kind of card. And Mark Carney, who spent his career inside the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England watching how leverage gets used inside financial systems, understands exactly what that card is worth. Let me translate that into a sentence a sixth grader could understand. If your friend asks you for your lunch every day and you say yes every day, that is normal. If your friend then announces to the school that your lunch is critical to their survival, you now have a negotiation. Carney just accepted the ask in words and opened a negotiation in structure. Ottawa did not slam the door. Ottawa left the door open, but the door now opens in two directions, north as well as south. That is the visible story, surface level, real, but not the whole story. But that's not the real story. Here's what actually happened. The hidden layer hides in three places: the bilateral language, the export numbers, and the timeline. Let me walk through each one. First, the bilateral language. When the U.S. side says more Canadian oil, it sounds like a technical request. In reality, it is a political act, because every time Washington publicly names Canadian crude as strategically important, it raises the cost for Washington of disrupting that supply. Tariffs on Canadian energy, for example, suddenly become suicidal. Border disruptions to pipeline flows become suicidal. Any trade move that touches energy becomes suicidal. Carney's answer in public was cooperative. Carney's answer in policy was structural. He accepted the compliment, but he is now building a system that makes Canada's economy less dependent on the United States, not more. That is the hidden bet. The public handshake is friendly. The private structural move is independence. Buried inside Carney's broader economic plan is the dual export goal. Canada wants to cut its trade dependence on the United States in half over a decade. Currently, roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports go to the U.S. That is a structural fact. It is not a policy choice. It is geography. It is history. It is the natural result of sharing a border, sharing a language, sharing a supply chain. But Carney's stated target, double non-U.S. exports, would change that number meaningfully. It would push non-U.S. trade from roughly 1/4 of total Canadian exports to closer to 1/3 within 10 years. That may not sound dramatic, but in trade flows, moving 1/3 is enormous. It changes where investment goes. It changes which ports expand. It changes which pipelines get built. And it changes one specific thing that Washington should care deeply about: where Canadian crude goes. In early 2025, Trump returned to office promising tariffs on Canada. Canada fought back. Limited retaliation, talks, postponements, brief extensions. By mid-2025, the U.S. and Canada were at an intense phase of trade talks, by Carney's own language. CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Trade Agreement, was up for review. That timeline matters because CUSMA is the rule of the road for cross-border commerce. Energy flows inside that agreement. Auto flows inside that agreement. Steel, aluminum, agriculture. If CUSMA gets rewritten in a way that punishes Canada, energy flows get caught in the crossfire. So while the press was covering the trade fights as a tariff story, the underlying story was Canada is preparing for a world where it cannot assume CUSMA survives. That is a strategic shift, and the pivot toward non-U.S. exports is the proof. Now, here is the part almost nobody reported. What nobody noticed is the crude math. Canada currently sits as the largest single source of foreign oil into the United States. By volume, Canada supplies roughly 60% of all U.S. crude imports. Daily flows of Canadian crude into the U.S. often run above 4 million barrels a day. That is more than Saudi Arabia sends anywhere by land. It is more than Mexico, more than Venezuela when flows are open. So the U.S. has in effect one dominant energy supplier if you exclude its own production, and that supplier is Canada. That means two things you have to hold in your head at the same time. One, Washington cannot afford to lose Canadian crude. The math does not exist yet for replacing it on short notice. You cannot ramp up Saudi volumes overnight. You cannot flip a switch on Venezuelan flows. You cannot redirect enough from West Africa or the North Sea to fill a 4 million barrel a day hole. Two, Canada knows it cannot afford to lose the U.S. market. Not entirely, not yet. The pipeline network is built south. The refineries are configured for Canadian heavy. The depots are calibrated to Canadian grades. That mutual dependence has been called integrated for decades. It is mutual, it is deep, it is comfortable. But Carney just put a "for now" inside that sentence. Let me say it again. The U.S. side asked for more. Carney said yes in words. Canada is preparing, in policy, for a world where more is not always the answer. The visible story was Washington winning the conversation. The hidden story is Ottawa rewriting the relationship underneath the conversation. And now, here's why this matters for the bigger picture. If you only watch the headlines, you'd think Canada just agreed to pump more oil and the story ends there. That would be a mistake. Because what's actually happening is structural, it's measurable, and it moves in one direction only. Let me stack the data points. Here is point 1. Canada is currently the dominant foreign oil supplier to the United States, accounting for roughly 60% of all crude imports by volume. There is no second-place country that comes close. Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and a handful of smaller producers fill out the rest. Canadian heavy crude is structurally integrated into U.S. Gulf Coast refineries. You cannot swap that out fast. Here is point 2. Canadian oil exports to the U.S. regularly exceed 4 million barrels per day. That is a daily 4 million barrel dependency. That is not a number you can redirect overnight. It would take years of pipeline, port, and refinery investment to reroute even half of that flow toward Asia or Europe. Here is point 3. Carney has set a public target to double Canada's non-U.S. exports over the next decade. Currently, the United States absorbs roughly 75% of Canadian exports. Reducing that share to closer to 2/3 through European, Asian, and Indo-Pacific diversification would be one of the largest single shifts in Canadian trade posture since the Auto Pact 60 years ago. Here is point 4. Carney's work history matters. Carney spent nearly a decade at the Bank of Canada. He spent 7 years as governor of the Bank of England. Through Brexit, through multiple crises, he understands how currency flows, capital flows, and balance of payments dynamics shape political negotiating positions better than any Canadian PM in modern history. Here is point 5. The U.S. side has been publicly framing Canadian energy as critical. Every time a senior American official calls Canadian crude essential or strategic, the leverage moves toward Ottawa. Carney has not rejected that language, he has accepted it, and is using it as a foundation for diversification leverage. Here is point 6. Canadian companies are already moving. Major pipeline proposals toward the Pacific coast are back on the table. The Trans Mountain expansion debate, LNG terminal plans on British Columbia's coast, and Asian trade missions are all part of the same pivot. This is not a slogan, it is steel and concrete in motion. Here is point 7. The CUSMA review clock is running. CUSMA must be reviewed by mid-2026. That review will determine the legal architecture of U.S.-Canada-Mexico trade for another decade plus. Energy is inside that review. Whatever Canada is doing now to position itself off U.S. is positioning itself for a post-CUSMA world. Here's point 8. The U.S. political cycle is also running. U.S. tariff threats, U.S. energy protectionism, U.S. Buy American rhetoric all create uncertainty for Canada. Diversification is the hedge against U.S. volatility. Stack those 8 points and the picture becomes clear. The story underneath the story is this. The United States asked Canada to do more of what Canada has always done. Carney accepted the ask politely. And then, quiet, deliberate, technical, he began to build the system that makes Canada less dependent on the United States over time. That is not a fight. That is a quiet redirection. It is not punitive. It is structural. It is not loud, it is steady. Washington asked Canada for more oil. Carney said, "We'll keep selling," and in the next breath he built a runway to sell to everyone else. Capital is not being weaponized here. It is being redirected, quietly, steadily, in every direction except the single direction Washington thought it could maintain forever. Let me close this the way I opened it, with the visible image. The U.S. asked for more barrels. Canada said yes. And while Washington was watching the handshake, Ottawa was quietly widening every other door out of the building. The door is still open, but it no longer opens only one way. While everyone was watching the handshake, the whole building was being quietly rebuilt around it. If you stayed with this analysis to the end, you understand why this story matters in ways that standard coverage hasn't captured. Subscribe, share this with someone tracking where North American energy is actually flowing, hit the like button, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. This kind of analysis only reaches the people who need it when viewers like you help it move. Thank you for being here.